Hello, I am Michele Leclaire, Director at Buckham Gallery. Today, I am joined by Flint artist Nancy Pennell, a printmaker whose work we are currently hosting at Buckham Gallery. Nancy's work is on view in the gallery January 15th through February 13th, 2021. But first, I would like to thank the individuals and organizations who support Buckham Gallery, including the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation, Michigan Council for Arts and Cultural Affairs, and the National Endowment for the Arts. The Genesee Grant Program made possible by the Genesee County Arts Education and Cultural Enrichment Millage Funds, your tax dollars at work. Oh. Nancy Pennell is a printmaker and painter whose work spans 40 years. Her artwork stems from lifelong observations in the natural world and its symbiotic relationships from which she derives her visual vocabulary. She has produced drawings, paintings, monotypes, intaglio prints, solar prints, and waterless lithographs, including various combinations, as well as handmade books. She now works mainly with colorful monotypes, which we'll be seeing here today, which include some printed on both sides of Japanese paper. She has taught workshops at Michigan State University, where she received a BFA, and at Mott Community College, where she continues to produce her work. She also has taught many art classes in various media for 25 years in the mid-Michigan area. Pennell has shown her work in a number of galleries throughout the Midwest, winning awards in several competitions, including first place, purchase, and one-person show awards at the Saginaw Art Museum, and other printmaking awards in Michigan. She is affiliated with Buckham Gallery, the Blue Heron Gallery, and Flint Artist Market. Her work can be found in many private and public collections throughout the United States, including Delta College, Mott Community College, and McLaren Hospital. Nancy Pennell is now living and working in the countryside outside of Flint, Michigan. Welcome, Nancy.
Hi.
How are you?
I am fine.
Thank you so much for agreeing to do this recorded artist talk. I appreciate it. It's a great way for us to hear about your work, especially during this times when we aren't gathering for events. So thank you. I appreciate it.
Oh, yeah, I'm grateful to have the opportunity.
Good. So I would like to learn more about these beautiful monotypes that we have at the gallery right now. Let's first talk about themes that are present in your artwork. There's definitely an overarching present theme.
Yes. This theme I've been working on for probably 4 years in my work, and it's nature, but specifically intimate spaces and how important these intimate spaces are in our whole ecological system. Since I live in the country, we have a lot of kind of wild spaces, and I noticed that the birds and the animals want to go there, and butterflies, insects, whatever. And when I say symbiotic relationship, I realized how much they depend on these spaces with just weeds, which we would think of as just weeds. And now they're important. And sometimes we look at them and we want to rip them out of the garden or rip them out of our yard. And sometimes it's best maybe just to leave some of the spaces the way they are, because this is nature at work. So I decided to show this in my work. I had an experience with our neighbor. We had a huge hedgerow next to our driveway, and our neighbor, it wasn't on our property, but it was right next to our property. And I could see little holes in the weeds where rabbits and bunnies and the birds would flock there. And, it would just be a safe place for them to go. And one day we came home from vacation and our neighbor had ripped out this whole hedgerow. And I thought, this is, I was a little upset because, you know, I had no control over it, for one thing. And for the other thing, you know, it just was a shame that now all the things living there had to find new homes. So, you know, which they, you know, they are natural beings, so they do find new homes, but it was just, it just affected me anyway.
Yeah, there's actually, I can thinking about some of these works that we have in the gallery, definitely show these sort of like intimates and with the texture. And so I'm picturing, I don't know if one of these was specifically the hedgerow that you're talking
Yes,
about, but I can imagine these have life and
yes,
hide and be protected in these spaces.
yes, that's exactly right. And I wanted to make them, I wanted to bring attention to these places and make them look beautiful.
Mhm.
And so that's where I brought in my use of color, to make these spaces look beautiful. So maybe the viewer might take a second look at
Yeah.
their own yards or spaces that they, you know, that's around them.
Well, yeah, there's so much more imagination in the untamed space rather than the overly manicured. Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. Sometimes I think we do over manicure
Mhm.
things.
Yeah.
So, and also uh, just the having plants around, you know, they take in carbon dioxide, and so this is very important for the whole climate. You know, they say that if we would plant a lot more trees on the earth, that we could take care of a lot of our climate,
Hmm.
you know, warming, or, you know, the warming that we have now,
Mhm.
just by doing that, because it takes in the carbon dioxide that we put out, and, you know, with our own breathing and every, you know, other
Right.
living beings.
And even the maintenance for these lawns and stuff produces a lot of carbon.
E- Exactly. You know, so many people need to fertilize, and they need to have their yards perfectly green. And that's why it's important to have natural spaces that we don't use these chemicals on, and we don't use things that are not really needed other than for our own enjoyment. So,
Yeah. Oh, great. Can we move maybe to the process a little bit? These are all monotypes. Actually, why don't you tell our viewers what a monotype is, and then your process a little bit.
okay. Well, a monotype is a print that's made from a plate or matrix, some sort of a substrate that you put ink on, but it has no etching into it.
Mhm.
So you cannot reproduce it more than once. The ink lies on the surface of the your plate. And in this case, I use a plexiglass plate.
Mhm.
So I roll ink onto the plate, and actually these I used, you can use any type of plate. Actually, I used these specific pieces. I used a piece of mat board rather than a plexiglass plate. A lot of times I do use plexiglass, but I use mat board instead, because I discovered a technique at one of the Southern Graphics, uh, their conferences. And this woman was doing these monotypes, and she was using different types of stencils. She was using a thicker stencil made out of mat board, and then she was using thinner stencil that was made out of a mylar. And she would cut these, and you actually put the thicker stencil underneath your mat board. So you need something that's a little bit more pliable than a sheet of plexiglass to do this. And when you roll it through, you put the stencil underneath the mat board that's been rolled with ink, then you put your paper on top of that. And when you roll it through the press, the image of the stencil underneath sort of embosses onto the, embosses up from the mat board, and it prints onto your paper.
Yeah. Wow.
So it gives these sort of diffused look where you can see fuzzy edges. And then if you put the Mylar stencil on top of the mat board, you can see a hard edge, because that's going to leave a really hard edge on your print. So for instance, this Untamed Space piece that I did, you can see the background is full of sort of these diffused images, and then you have it cut by the sharp images, which the Mylar produces, the stencil. So basically they're all done with the type of stenciling. I do go back in sometimes after the print is finished, and I do a little bit, sometimes a little bit of work with a pastel pencil or a oil pastel once in a while, if I want to just enhance something a little bit more. But most of it's done just with the printing through the press.
Well, that's really interesting. I was curious about because the contrast between some of the soft edges and the hard edges.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, is the Mylar, is that make the more of the negative space look because the ink is then on the other side and doesn't go onto the paper?
Yes, exactly. It blocks whatever ink you have on your, rolled out on your substrate. It blocks that ink from printing. But if you have another color that you've already printed onto your paper, then that other color will show through. So that way you can get other colors showing through. Say you put a light blue on first, and then you print a darker color over the top, but you have the stencil on top, your hard edge stencil will appear to be blue, and that's because it just blocks the darker from printing. So that's why I print in many layers, so that I can get this variation of color. And sometimes too, I will use the Mylar stencils that I've printed, and I will actually, there will be ink on the bottom side of it. And I can actually use that on another piece, and I can actually run that through the press, and it will print the ink that's on the stencil. So you can get different effects by doing that also.
That's
so
really cool.
Yeah, there's a million ways that you can use the stencils. And sometimes I will print once, and there will be ink left, and there will be things that are taken from the stenciling. There will be things, some of the ink will be taken off. And then if I run a ghost print, which is a second print without putting any more ink on, I can get that. I can get different looks with that too.
Yeah.
Especially for my underlayings. I usually will I will work on more than one piece at a time. So I'll print once, and then some of the ink will come off, and there will be, images left from the stencils. And then I'll print that onto another piece of paper. It will be lighter, but that's what we call a ghost print. And that will be used maybe as the under printing for another print. And, as long as there's ink left on the paper, I will usually print it on something. And sometimes even if my paper is smaller than where I've rolled the ink, there will be edges around it. And sometimes I will put other pieces of paper just on the edge. So like actually this Blue Dance, was one of those where you can see one edge looks kind of greenish.
Mhm.
That was printed just using the edge of another print. And then I printed on top of that with some orange and some other colors. So you get these unique types of things happening on the paper.
I think that's really interesting to hear about. Usually when I've thought about monotypes, I usually think of that as just being a single, run through the press. But
Yes.
all these layers, I mean, it's obvious. I mean, looking at the pieces, how that there's so many layers. I'm really intrigued by this process of rerunning your prints through.
Yes,
It's
yes,
beautiful.
and sometimes, like I said, sometimes I'll just print in one little portion of the paper because it's at the edge of something else, and running it through, and I think it creates so much depth
Mhm.
in the pieces. You can really look through and into the pieces. They're not just on the surface, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah,
Gives
definitely.
more a three-dimensional look.
Something else really kind of caught my attention. I'm going to bring up another one of my favorites.
Ah, yes.
There is, when you mentioned printing on cardboard as your plate,
Yeah,
or mat board, excuse me, not cardboard.
yeah, yeah, that
Cardboard.
board.
That would absorb some of the ink and
Mhm.
that soft kind of texture. I'm wondering if, because there's sort of makes me think of like an aqua tint or something, or a soft
Mhm.
ground effect on the prints. I'm wondering if they may be the mat board soft texture as opposed to a plexiglass or a zinc plate or something lends to that.
Yes, yes, definitely. And usually I will not just take a mat board and roll one color on it. I will roll another color right over the top
Mhm.
of the first color, which also lends to other things happening, because sometimes, and then when you put the stencil on, it lifts some of the color off, and then there's darker color left where the stencil hasn't lifted off. And then it might reveal another color that's underneath it on my actual mat board that I've been rolling on. And sometimes, in a few instances, not in this particular show, but I have other pieces where I have actually liked what's happening on the mat board as well as what's happening on the paper that I'm printing off of it. And I have actually framed some of those. I
Oh,
like them
wow.
just as well. They're different, but they have their own look to them too.
Mhm.
And so then I started using, instead of using just plain old mat board, I use a better, like I was using a hot press illustration board to roll my ink on. It rolled really nicely. Plus it's a little more archival than
Mhm.
just plain old mat board. Or I will use some of my museum mat board too, which is all cotton.
Mhm.
So that works too. The hot press illustration board worked really well though, because the ink went on it really nicely.
Mhm.
And then I've used those and framed them.
Yeah,
So
oh, I would love to see those. I'm really
yeah,
intrigued.
well, yeah, a couple of those are up at the Carmanos, or is it Carmanos
Mhm.
Cancer Center. A
Oh,
couple of
excellent.
pieces that I did that way are over there. So
Oh, wonderful.
yeah, if anybody
Um,
wants to check that out too.
yeah. So I would like to talk about your double-sided
Okay.
monotypes. Let me bring
Yeah.
up Entangled here, because these
Yeah.
are gorgeous. So
Yeah.
how did these evolve? How did you come to present?
Yeah. Well, that's interesting because I noticed as I was printing, and it depends on how thick your ink is when you're rolling it on. I'm using thinner papers. I usually use thin Japanese paper. Some are a little bit heavier than others, but the thinner papers especially, the ink would bleed through to the other side.
Mhm.
And I was getting these effects that I liked on the back side. And so I thought, well, why don't I, print on one side and then I will reverse it and print on the other side and have something that it is similar in color, because I'm using primarily the same color, but sometimes you can use colors that don't bleed through also. And that just happens pretty much.
Oh, okay.
Sometimes you don't know what's going to bleed through and what's not going to bleed through. So, that's kind of one of those things that I really, really enjoy about doing this type of printmaking, is that part of it is planned and there is a lot of it that is unplanned. And so you have these random things happening that you would never think of, that I would never think of doing or could never duplicate in any other way. So.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I was just wondering, do you use oil-based inks or water-based inks, or does that lend to this at all?
I have, just because I have used the oil-based inks, I believe it's probably not as good for the environment as I would like, but I try to use, we clean up with cooking oil. We don't use mineral spirits to clean up. And also the boards, once you roll the boards out, like I said, sometimes they come out to be a piece of artwork, so I keep them and I frame them. Other times, if they don't, I just will roll over the top and reuse them. So, but anyway, the inks are oil-based, and I have not tried it with other kinds of ink yet. I have used other kinds of ink before, like the Akua ink which is, it's not really water-based, but it cleans up with soap and water. But that has a tendency to not dry as easily because it only dries when it's absorbed by the paper. And because I work in so many layers, I'm afraid that when I get to the upper layers, it's not going to dry. Because you can leave the Akua inks out in the air, not even covering them, and they will stay that way.
Oh, wow.
On a piece of glass. They will just, eventually, maybe after a year or so, they might start to dry, but you could put inks out on a palette and they won't dry. Just, I don't know, because of their makeup.
Yeah.
So anyway, I didn't think that it would be as conducive to using in this particular thing. So I've stayed with the oil-based inks. They're coming out with new products all the time, so I may try some newer things. They're coming out with oil-based inks that they say clean up with water. So we'll see. I don't know.
Yeah.
I haven't tried them yet, but I might.
Yeah, I just wanted to show a couple more of your the double-sided pieces. We have this one.
Yeah, this piece here was actually started where I did not use the mat board to roll my ink. I did use a piece of plexiglass, and I manipulated the ink with just a touch of mineral spirits where you can remove the ink.
Oh, yeah.
So that's how this was.
So then that was a subtractive.
Subtractive, yes, and then printed. Yeah, so you roll the ink on, you pull off in some manner, and this I brushed through, I think, with little mineral spirits and removed the ink and then printed. But it was also then printed. I think this particular piece, I think I did print totally on a piece of plexiglass and manipulated the ink.
Yeah.
Probably the only one in the group. The rest are all done in the other manner.
We have grassland here.
Yeah. And this actually, this is another technique that I use once in a while that I used in this, is it's called a trace print. So some of it was done with printing leftover ink that was left on a plate. And then I took and rolled ink out, and you can actually put the paper. This is a very thin piece of paper, so it's very easy to do. And you just lay the paper over the ink. And from the back side, you use, you can even use your finger or sort of a dull pencil or a dull something. And you just draw through it, and it just picks up the ink in those areas. So that's how I got this grassy look. It was by just picking up the ink by tracing off the back of it.
Wow.
So, yeah, and it's interesting how, on one side there's brighter colors, which I printed on the one side, and the other side just a touch of that comes through, but not as much. So it gives like a totally different look. More playful, maybe.
Yeah, and it does have a more an energy,
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah. How's your art changed through the years?
Well, I've always worked with nature, but I think previous to doing these prints, I was working with landscapes that were like broad landscapes, way in, lots of depth, large area, it would look like a broad area that you would see. And then I went to this intimate, these intimate spaces, as I said, partly because of the technique that I had seen, and I knew as soon as I saw that technique that it would be perfect for doing what I wanted to do. So it just came about. And so, I've just progressed through the years, and I've done all different kinds of printmaking. I've done intaglio, and like I said, in solar prints and black and white, but I really love colors. So I just, I'm a painter. I started out as a painter, and I always thought of myself as being a painter. And then when I discovered all these different printmaking techniques, I just really liked it, and I kind of had a feel for it. And then I liked that randomness where painting is a little more specific. This, you bring in surprises that happen that, is hard to duplicate in another medium. So anyway, so that's how it progressed from broad landscapes to very intimate ones.
Yeah, well, that's wonderful. I'm glad you're doing these because they're gorgeous. It's been a pleasure to have them, to be able to come in here and be with your work, and kind of, it's been really nice.
I like to make things that people will look at, and the more they look at it, they discover new things within it. I'm going, oh, wow, look at this. There's this little hint of this color over here, or these little lines that have come out, by putting a pre-inked stencil on top, and only part of it will print. And so you'll get little lined edges and little details that would be very difficult to produce any other way.
Yeah, definitely. So do you have any new projects that you are considering, where you're going from here, or are you just waiting to get back to that print shop?
Yeah, well, I'm waiting to get back to the print shop, definitely. And I did start a large project where I have 3 panels, three long panels of Japanese paper, and it was paper that I bought. I'm really interested in using different types of Japanese paper. I really discovered it, and I just love printing on it. It just prints so beautifully. And the Japanese people make this paper that was originally made for scrolls. So they're narrow, maybe only 12 inches wide, but they may be 57 inches long, and they're made for scrolls. And so I wanted to use several sheets of the paper in conjunction with each other and next to each other to do a large piece. And this one, I'm going back a little bit because it was so large, the pieces were so long that it was hard to do the stenciling on it. So I could get a large piece of plexiglass. So I was using plexiglass in my roller and manipulating the ink in different ways. And so in a way, I'm kind of going, using some techniques that I have used before just because of the size of the paper mainly.
Yeah.
But yeah, but I'm also working on the whole theme of, more intimate spaces. And I had a milkweed growing in amongst my other grasses. And I told my husband, just let it grow because I know that's where the monarch butterflies lay their eggs.
Yeah.
And so I'm doing this huge piece that's sort of based on the milkweed.
Wonderful. I look forward to seeing. Oh, well, Nancy, thank you so much for talking with me today. This has been really lovely, and I appreciate you taking the time.
Oh, yeah. I'm glad that I can share my art. That's what I want to do. And if they get a little bit more insight into what I do, that's great.
Yeah, so I would just like to say again that this has been In Conversation with Nancy Pennell. Her work is on view at Buckham Gallery and on our website. It can be found in an online viewing room. Please check out buckhamgallery.org. And thank you again.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Thank you.